Good afternoon. Happy 4 o'clock. Hope you're having a great day. I'm so glad to finish my day with you guys. So I promised you something yesterday. I'm going to make good on that promise. I'm going to ask one question before we dive back into the right into the SPA, and that is any questions on the market conditions, questions or graphs and small scripts that we covered yesterday, because that is part of the pricing and positioning conversation, right? You have to start with the macro, which is the market conditions conversations, and now we're going to dive into the micro. Anything you thought of, anything you woke up and said, I have a question about that. That doesn't make sense, or anything you want to address before we dive into the SPA? Yes, Dana.
Yeah, are you gonna let us know how we can get those, what was called brokered stats or broker, whatever it was that you made the chart from? With that bar chart?
Broker metrics?
Yeah, broker metrics, how we get to that, how we can get that?
Yes, and that, as I mentioned yesterday, that's going to be in a separate class, right? So that is now scheduled. You'll be receiving an email late tonight on when that, I think it's next Thursday. I think that's when I put it on the calendar for. Because we had Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday all kind of full up. So it is next Thursday, I believe, at 11. But I'll verify that, and you'll get an email on it later tonight.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Do note that broker metrics only exists in the offices, right? Because the reality of that system is so any other questions about market conditions, the charts or the graphs before we move forward? Yes, Frank.
Rick, on the page that had the questions where you asked the seller, what have you heard, where have you heard this, etc.
Yes.
What if they say something that you don't necessarily agree with? What if today someone is saying, well, I heard that the market, is no longer good. It's no longer good for a seller. It's slowed down. It hit the brakes. What do you reply, or do you just say,
So great question. So if they were to say that, right, that would probably be the answer to question number one. I'm curious what you've heard or recently heard about the housing and or financial markets, right? And so if they answer that question with, I heard it's terrible, or it is terrible, and they've heard it's great. If they answer you with information that you believe to be inaccurate, that's why those next couple of questions are there, right? So then you move right to the next question to say, that's fascinating. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? What specifically have you heard? Well, I heard, everyone's been talking about this whole big rush for the last 18 months, but now it's stopped dead in its tracks. No one's moving to Connecticut. No one's moving out of New York. Nothing's happening. It's a horrible, horrible time to be a seller. Excellent. Do me a favor, Mr. Seller. Dig into that a little bit more. Where exactly did you hear that news? Right, because, and that's just the next question on the page, right? So what we gave you was, it's interesting, if you remember what Alex did yesterday, because of the answer I gave Alex, she actually skipped one of those next questions, because I kind of gave her the answer to the next question all wrapped up in my first answer, right? I guess I got excited and got ahead of myself. But this is written for you to be able to keep digging. And at the end of the day, right, because where did you hear that news? Sometimes it's, oh, well, my brother-in-law called me from, God knows where. I don't know, someplace the market is actually terrible. I'm not sure where that is in the United States, or maybe it's not in the United States, right? Sometimes people have this, they translate information from somebody that they hear it from and just make it valid or relevant in their world. I've already had conversations with people where, as I told you, from 2013 through about a little less than 2 years ago, the market in Connecticut was just doing kind of nothing. It wasn't up, it wasn't down, it was just kind of flat and bumping around and whatever. And I would have people say to me things like, oh, well, the market's, rocking and rolling. Well, where did you hear that information? well, we were just visiting my sister up in Boston, or we were in Austin, Texas, on vacation, and we heard, well, yes, that's right. Prior to the pandemic boom, places like Boston, Massachusetts, and Austin, Texas were in fact going gangbusters, and yet locally we were not. And so the part of the reason you asked that question about where did you hear that news, like, can you just tell me more about it, is to help them recognize that sometimes news is not relevant locally as it might be someplace else, right? Maybe they heard it on the news and they were talking nationally. Well, real estate news nationally is not necessarily relevant to an area of one state. It's kind of like turning the weather on in the morning and having Al Roker say, the temperature in the United States today is 72 degrees. Well, that's not right? It might be 72 degrees someplace. It might even be 72 degrees a lot of places, but it certainly isn't 72 degrees in all places in the entire country. And Frank, the tail end of the answer to your question is, when you go through the questions, if they still sound wrong, or they still have an opinion, or they're still kind of railing about some whatever, yes, what you said is 100% right. You get to nod your head, say, I understand, make some notes, and then ask them the next question. This is not the moment for you to address issues. It's for you to hear the download that they're interested in giving you, to give yourself some perspective about what's in their head. Now, what might happen is that same conversation may come up a little later when you go through the SPA, which we're about to do, because now we're taking macro information and making it specific to their house in the micro version of this. And so the whole thing may come up all over again. And then you get to address an objection, handle it. And I'll show you how to do that. What I've noticed, however, is that oftentimes when people have really strong opinions one way or the other, whether they're incorrect or correct, the strength of those opinions starts to temper itself as you continue through the process. Because now you're giving them more data, you're giving them more information. And remember, nobody wants to look stupid. Human beings want to look good and be right in front of other people. And so as they start to see that the facts don't match what's in their head, or the facts don't quite match what their brother-in-law in Boston said, they start to doubt some of the information in their head, and they might ask some questions around it. Or they recognize that they had invalid information because you just put valid information in front of them. So the short version is trust in the process. Don't be distracted by what seem like wrong answers at that moment in time. Just keep going through the process. It'll either self-correct, or those same issues will come up later when you can then go ahead and address them. Does that help, Frank? I think you're muted, my friend.
Sorry. In part, you're saying by sort of asking where that comes from, you're kind of directing them to their own answer. Like you said, the brother-in-law, Boston. Oh, okay, Boston.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, national news. So without directly answering them, you're sort of directing them. Okay, I understand that. And just to play devil's advocate a little bit longer, if they look at you and say, why, you don't agree? Then you sort of continue along that line and say, I really don't know about the Boston market or the Houston market or whatever you said.
Yeah, so I think if someone were to continue to push me to say, don't you agree with what I'm saying? What I would say is, what I do or do not agree with is not quite as relevant, perhaps, as we want to make that. However, what I really do trust in is the process which I've brought to you today. And so what I would encourage us to do is, instead of getting distracted by agree or disagree in terms of random information, let's keep pushing through this process if we could together. And if you still have those same questions or concerns, 10 or 12 minutes from now, let's jump back into that conversation. Right? I want to help them understand that the process is there to help them. And sometimes people want to jump ahead and shortcut the process. Just tell me the number. Nah, I'm gonna go through the process. Right? Trust in the process. Trust that this process is here for a reason. And again, I'm not answering your question. If you still have it 10 or 12 minutes from now, I'm happy to jump right back in and we can have that conversation. And 9.5 times out of 10, that the process addresses that. Oh, okay, right. It's kind of like the non-written script. You're kind of floating over everything, saying, okay, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. Oh, there it is. Right? That's not an actual script, right? But it's kind of how you're floating over the whole thing, saying, yep, we're gonna get to that. Let's just get it. Let's get there the way it's written instead of bouncing back and forth. Here, let me say this about that. You will be challenged the first couple of times that you run through this, because remember, sellers don't know their lines. Sellers don't have a script in front of them. And so sometimes they kind of throw curveballs. And the skill that you develop as a consultant is to recognize when someone is pulling you off of the process, and knowing full well and trusting and being confident in the fact that you're driving the bus. You don't have to jump to answer a question just because someone put it on the table. You can jot that down to say, always validate, right? Wow, great question, great question. I do get asked that a lot. And I think what you'll find, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, is that throughout our process, you will get a number of answers to that very question. Just in case, I'm going to jot it down right here, and we'll cycle back to it shortly. Right? You just need to develop that skill of recognizing when someone's pulling you off and not allow that to happen. Not rigidly. No, please don't answer that. No soup for you. Some of you are either too young or have never watched Seinfeld before to know what no soup for you means. Google
Go
it.
to that place.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I had the guy yell at me when I was pregnant. That was not fun.
Oh yeah, just when you really need that soup. My goodness.
Yeah, left me in tears because, you're emotional then.
Right, does that help, Frank?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. How do I want to say this? Sometimes we are so focused on providing what we think or feel is great customer service that we forget that we are as valuable a player in a dialogue, in a conversation, as the client is. You know what I mean? Does that what I just said make sense, or does it only make sense in my little pea brain? Right? And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying don't give good customer service. What I'm saying is sometimes we cede control way too quickly or way too easily because we think that makes us more appealing or more agreeable to the client. And we think, oftentimes falsely, that that's what the client is looking for, someone to nod their head and say, yes, yes, yes. I'll tell you that person at my house wouldn't get the job, right? Because we're always modeling behavior. And so if all we're ever doing is saying yes, 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 yes to the person asking the questions, in my head, I'm thinking as a seller, okay, so what happens when this person that's in front of me just saying yes, yes, yes to me and allowing me to drive the bus? What happens when they're in charge of the negotiations on my most valuable asset? Who drives the bus then? Do they just allow the other agent to drive the bus? How does that help me? Right? You're always modeling behavior. If there's one thing that I hope you learn in the 4 or 5 weeks that we are together, because I think it's the thing I say the most throughout this period of time, is that you are always modeling behavior, business or personal. You are always modeling behavior. Is that the behavior that gets you hired? Is that the behavior that you think does the job? Or are you modeling behavior that is actually doing the exact opposite than what you want it to be doing, right? You have to always think about who's watching and how they're watching and how they're making those judgment calls in their head. It's why I'm always fascinated when people say to me, well, the last thing I would ever want to be as a real estate agent is aggressive. Oh, goodness. Are you kidding? Do you really think that people who want to sell their homes wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to find the wussiest, most agreeable real estate agent I can find to represent me and my most valuable asset? Of course not. And because you're always modeling behavior, if that's how you show up in the interview process, in the pursuit of business process, well, that's how they think you'll behave. You can't show up wussily. Is that a word, wussily? We'll have to write that one down and see if we can submit that to Webster's. Right, but you can't show up that way and then make statements like, "Oh, I'm the best negotiator." Really? Well, you've kind of sounded like a wet blanket up until now. Do you see how there's a disconnect there? We've entered the conversation of all the verbal and nonverbal stuff that goes along with your skills that ultimately people make decisions on. That's like the psychology behind all of this. And yet I bring it up because it's part of the way that you will or will not get hired. And so it's important for you to know that it exists. Nobody ever told me about this stuff. Luckily, I was naturally aggressive. And yet I was aggressive in such a way that I told you my listening appointments were 3 hours long. And so then I needed to learn a different path. I needed to learn how to be efficiently aggressive. I was verbosely aggressive. Right? I kind of feel like a thesaurus today. How much fun can we have with words today? I don't know. All right. All right. So it's Frank's fault that we're here. Just so we're clear, I made a promise. Frank had me break my promise. Nah, I love me that Frank. So any other questions on the market conditions conversation we addressed yesterday, or shall we cruise forward into the SPA? Okay, cruising forward. Were you able to read this through at least twice? As I had asked, I hope you got through it at least once or twice between last night and tonight, because it will just kind of help you feel familiar with it. So what I'm going to do, if it's all right with you, is I'm going to read this through from top to bottom, and I'm not going to ask any of you to be the seller, right? I want you just to hear the through line of how this goes. Then we're going to go back to the top and kind of break it apart a little bit. And then if you want me to, I can do it again with one of you as a seller, so you can kind of hear what the answers sometimes look like. How's that sound? Then we'll talk about objection handling and what happens if things skid off the rails and all that stuff, right? All right, so the first thing I want to do is just be clear with you about what this is. It is not a CMA process. If I had my way, everybody within the sound of my voice, whether you're here live today or listening to this recording, would banish the term CMA from their vocabulary forevermore. The reason that we created, and yes, we created the SPA, is for a couple of different reasons. Can anybody think of what those reasons might be? Why did we create a new version? There are some simple ones and some less simple ones. Go ahead, Donna.
To have the word positioning in it?
Oh man, do I love you more than my luggage? Yes, indeed. Right? Because of two words that I want to make sure that you get clear. And that is the word strategy and the word positioning. Right? The CMA doesn't talk about anything. It talks about nothing. We wanted this to have some bite to it. This is a strategy that we're bringing to the table, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, and it's all about the positioning of your property. That's what we're doing here. So yes, Donna, thank you for that. The words were very carefully chosen. Why else? Yes, Dana.
Well, the CMA is very much focused on which homes have recently sold, and this has more to do with how we position a home in the market that exists right now today as we're speaking.
Yeah, that's so right. You guys are so freaking smart. It just makes me want to jump up and down, right? Because that's right. That's 100% right. The CMA is this looking backwards tool, right? The SPA has everything to do with positioning, which has everything to do with not just sold properties, with your current competition, because positioning has to do with who you're competing against, not just the rear view mirror. There's one other reason I want to make sure that we get out there. Anybody think of it? It's a simple one and a really important one. Yes, Alex.
I think this is it. It's that the CMA is painfully dense with data, depending on who's presenting.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And I'm going to expand upon your answer if I could, right? It's painfully dense with data, and it's something that everybody uses, right? So every single real estate agent talks about CMA, CMA, CMA. I told you guys a couple of weeks ago that our goal was to always have you look, sound, and be different. So that if you are one of a line of people who has to go in, well, you're showing up with something unique, something different, something that sounds cool, something that sounds more relevant, something that isn't 416 pages long, bound in leather, right? Sent off to the publisher. Because those CMAs, sometimes people print them off of those. I mean, we still have it for you because some of you like it, that toolkit thing. Oh, my stars. I'm not sure why anyone would use that toolkit thing. All the fluff and the BS up front, and the graphs and the let me tell you the story of the planet of real estate. Oh man, come on. Here's what's real. Nobody cares about any of that. They only care about their home and the specific data as it relates to their home, which can be accomplished with the best 3 sold properties and a list of actives. For those of you who read this last night or this morning, you know that's exactly where we're headed. The best 3 sold comps and a list of actives. Those are the tools you need to get the job done. It does not have to be couched in 77 pages of fluff, right? And what's fascinating to me is that people think that those 77 pages of fluff make them look smarter. And I would argue with you that it actually does the opposite, because it has you relying on some canned, computer-generated presentation that, frankly, most of the people who've read it, who use it, have never read it. They don't even know what it says, right? It's, oh, look at all those fancy pages that talk about Keller Williams, and they talk about the market, and they talk about the this. Here's what I see when I look at that. Here are pages and pages of wasted time and or information that I expect my agent to know. So if I ask a question, they can discuss with me, not give it to me in some computer-generated printout. I don't know, maybe that's just me. So again, be careful about how you feel like you're presenting yourself. Less is more in this scenario, in my humble opinion. And again, I've done it both ways. I don't speak to you from the position of this is better because I only have done this one. I speak to you from the position of I've done it both ways. I've done it like 17 different ways, to be truly honest with you. And the old ways of doing that CMA, they are just that. They are old ways. And if you think sellers don't pick up on that and recognize it, right? They want someone who's current. They want someone who gets it. They want someone who can boil it down to the important pieces and give it to them straight. Remember, there are no sellers who wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm so excited. I have 3 appointments with 3 real estate agents today. I can't wait to get through their hour-long appointments, each and every one of them, because I'm sure they're going to be unique and different. No, they're tortured by that. They don't want to have to listen to all that over and over again. That's why you've got to just be there first and be awesome, be the one, and just take the listing. Ronnie.
Oh, do you feel like a lot of the customers are that savvy that they're interviewing a lot of people, or do you find that in most cases with your agents, they're going in and they're just they're going in and winning the deal versus somebody actually, setting it up with meeting with your agents and then going on to the next 2 or 3? I mean, obviously, if you're a good closer, you're getting it on the first deal, but I'm just wondering, out of the people that want to list their house, do they generally visit with more than one realtor?
I would say the answer to that today is 50-50.
Okay.
Right. And here, and it's an interesting question, because here's the follow-up to that 50-50 answer. Statistically, NAR says, and I'm not going to have the exact number for you. I don't remember it. It's between 70 and 80%. It's something high, right? So let's just pick 75 as the middle ground there. NAR says about 75% of sellers only meet with one real estate agent. So now Ronnie's saying, well, why did he just answer my question with 50-50? I'm going to get there, right? So NAR says 75% of all sellers only meet with one. If you find that you are always in competition, that's a relationship issue, right? Now we're right back to database. How are you communicating with your database at a high level so that you're getting the come list me calls because you've developed and cultivated relationships? That drives that number back down. I think locally, the way sellers think, the answer is 50-50. And what that says to me is that locally, we need to do a better job of communicating at a high level and capturing more relationships so that we can match that NAR stat. There is a top tier, like the top 5% of mega listing agents across the country who drive that number way up. That's why my answer is different than the national average. So it's an area that I believe that as an industry, certainly locally, and I don't get to be responsible for the industry, I get to be responsible for all of you. We need to raise the level of play on that. Because if you find you're always in competition, you have to go back to why am I in competition? I'm either not developed, one of the things that Gary taught me is if your business is more than 50%, this is relevant, so give me a second to wrap it around. If your business is more than 50% referrals, like database, so if it's stranger heavy, you're not leveraging your database enough. If your business is more than 50% from your database, right, you're not leveraging your money enough because now you're not attracting strangers. So there's that balancing act. Are you doing everything that you need to do from a prospecting perspective with the database? And are you doing everything you need to do as a business owner from a marketing perspective to make sure that you're still attracting strangers? That's the pull. That's how businesses grow, right? It's not necessarily one or the other. Make sense? Okay. So those are the reasons why the SPA was created. Yes, Julie, do you have a question?
No, just wanted to follow up on what you were just saying. That's just such a great point. I was just working on my database today, and I don't know that I'm so much focused on one versus the other, and that it's just a huge thing to hear once more. So
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. And all credit to Gary, because that's where I learned it from, right? I'll tell you, it's funny. I can remember very specifically this day. I remember who it is. He's still an agent. He's a retired agent, but he's an agent still in our offices today. When I was at Century 21, we used to come in, and there was a listings board and a pending business board, and we used to write our own new stuff on the board. Like when you took a new listing, you came in, you wrote your name and your new listing and the price on the board, so that there was some kind of tracking. And then on the pending side, whenever you sold a house, you wrote your name and your whatever. And one day I came in, it was a Monday or a Tuesday, and I was kind of downloading from my last couple of days, and I had written a bunch of new things on the board. I had taken a couple of new listings, I had put a couple of things under agreement, and one of my colleagues was there and said to me, "Hey, would you do me a favor? Can you just tell me, like, where is all that coming from?" And I turned and I looked at the board and I thought, well, that's a great question. Let me answer that. And I looked and very quickly realized that the answer to the question wasn't simple. I said, well, that new listing came from an expired that I called. That new listing came from my database. That new listing actually came from an open house neighbor who came to an open house like 3 months ago that I've been following up with, and they're finally ready and just listed. That pending came from here. Like, it was all different sources. It wasn't like I got to look at it and say, oh, they're all from my database. Oh, they're all from expireds. Oh, they're all from open houses. And that was an aha for me. I loved the fact that he asked me that question, because it showed me just how multifaceted my business actually was. And there was a reason why, for me personally, my business grew very fast right out of the gate. It's because I didn't limit myself to, like, for me, it was like a 10 or 12 town radius, and it was every source all the time. It didn't matter to me where it came from. And then over time, I started to hone the geography a little bit and started referring some of the, like, from the outer rim, from where I was located, and focused a little bit more on towns closer to me, because what I found was I could get more done if I shrunk my geography a little bit and refer to some of the outer towns. And then as my database grew, I got more and more referral heavy, but never gave up expireds and open houses. So for me in my business, it was always a little of this and a little of that. That ended up being 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. Right? It ended up not being a small amount of business. It was actually a large amount of business, but it never really came from any one place. My hand was kind of all over the place. Why on earth am I talking about this? Does anybody know? Is it Julie's fault? I think it is Julie's fault.
You're talking about stranger heavy and how to tell based on your results,
Yeah.
where you're getting your business.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well,
Right.
and sometimes I feel like you think like you have to get all of these, you have to prospect and get all of these people in your database, when you really, sometimes should really focus in and look at your own people first. Also, I guess it's a merit of both kind of thing.
It is that. It's my business was always one from column A, one from column B, one from column C, and there were like, there was column Y, right? Because it was just. Now, there's not that many sources of business, clearly, but you get my point, right? It was always just one from here, one from there, one from here, one from there. And I don't think that's a bad way to build a business. It certainly wasn't for me. I made good money pretty quickly, right? And then again, once I understood how to generate business and earn an income, I then got to mold it differently and make some different decisions about geography and about where I wanted to focus. But as I've said a number of times, my main goal when I first got my real estate license was to get in and make money, right? I had a child at home, and I had a mortgage to pay, and I needed to make money. Like coming home and looking at my 2-year-old and saying, yeah, you know what, we're gonna have to wait until next week to eat because I have a closing next week. So if you could just hang tight, just 6 days more, and there'll be plenty of food, right? That wasn't cutting it. That wasn't working. He wanted to eat every day, 3 times a day. Can you imagine this kid? My goodness. All righty. So the SPA. I'm going to read through it once, as I said, so listen to the through line here. So, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, do you have any other questions on the economics and market conditions data that we discussed earlier? No? Excellent. So if it's okay with you, let's move to a more specific version of this discussion and really focus in on how all of this affects you and your home. In order to be successful and obtain the result that you are looking for, I'd like for us to spend a little time examining the market through the eyes of both the buyer and the bank's appraiser. How does that sound? Great. Let's take a look at the best 3 comparable properties to yours that have sold in Wilton in the past 3 months. Boom, boom, and boom. Here they are. I'm curious, have you seen any of these houses? So if you would just take a moment and review each of these comparable homes. I think I read that wrong. Would you take a moment and review each of these basically, all right. Telling you, I can't see the damn words anymore. Don't get old, I'm telling you what. All righty.
And readers.
Would you take a moment and review each of these comparable homes? Again, I'd like for you to look at them through the buyer's eyes. Now, if you had to buy one of these homes today, which one would it be? And why did you choose that one? Excellent. And would you agree that this property is basically comparable to your home? Great. Now here is a list of all of the current competition in this range. As a reminder, the main data point from the market conditions information that we discussed earlier was the word precise, yes? So when you combine that, the word precise, with the comparable data that you just reviewed, where do you feel you should position your property to outperform any and all other properties for sale? Great. I think you're making a fantastic decision. Now, all we need to do is sign the contract and allow me to get started. Okay, so there's the SPA with a little bump in the middle, right? But there's the SPA. Let's go back and just start at the top and kind of review what we just did. And then I'll go through and do it again, and someone can volunteer to be my seller. Before we go back to the top, what do you notice? What did you hear? What do you like? What don't you like? Go ahead, Dana.
Well, I like, in essence, it has the appearance that you're ceding the power to them, even though we all know you're not. So you're asking them questions and you're getting them to answer the ultimate question about price instead of you telling them a price.
Yeah, that's right. It's the ultimate consultative script, right? Remember, the power in being consultative lies in self-discovery, right? When people self-discover the answers that are relevant to their scenario, they trust them far more than if they just listen to you give what you believe the answer is. Self-discovery is the key here. It's the key to most consultative questions. You want to help guide someone through a process where they get to the end and be like, oh, yeah, that's pretty clear. It's like staring at me right in the face. Now, remember, I said yesterday, all of our sellers are smart. Some of our sellers don't necessarily want to share that they see the answer. They all see it. Please don't be fooled by that. It's not a matter of them not getting it. They all get it. Some are just more reluctant than others to jump on the agreement wagon, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute. So we start with, do you have any other questions on the economics and market conditions data we just discussed? That specifically is referencing, by the way, the 7 questions plus the 2 short graphs with those scripts. That's the market conditions stuff. There's almost never questions about it because it's short. And yet you ask it to make sure that we can move forward without them lingering in any unknowns in those last issues. You can see there the script says if they say yes, then go back, right? Don't ask the question, and when they say yes, say, well, sucks for you, let's move on, right? That doesn't work also so well. So if they have a question, great, what specifically do you have questions around? Well, that graph with all the colored lines on it, can we just go back to that? I have a quick question. Absolutely, ba-boom, and we go back. What's the question? How can we address that? And they ask the question, you answer the question. Anything else while we're on this? Nope. Anything else about any of the other data that we reviewed? Nope. Okay, great, now we can move forward, right? But you see how important that check-in is, because you don't want to leave their brain hanging in the last segment. And then, of course, you move into paragraph 2, you have a permission-based transition statement again. If it's okay with you, let's switch gears, let's move to a more specific version of this discussion and really focus in on how all of this affects you and your home. I know it says your home there. I always like the you and your home. Feel free to write some stuff. If I say it and you like that it sounds better that way, then fill it in. If not, just go with the words that are here. Right? I do have my own small adaptations to some of these scripts that you may have noticed I throw in there. I'm not even sure I recognize I do it most of the time. But you and your home is how I address that. We go on to say, in order to be successful and obtain the result you're looking for, I'd like us to spend a little time examining the market through the eyes of both the buyer and the bank's appraiser. How does that sound? Why are we, what is that about? Why are we asking them to look through the eyes of the buyer and the bank's appraiser?
We want to know they'll get their mortgage approved.
Yeah, right. Those eyeballs are the only 2 that matter, right? The buyer's eyes, they have to actually come to the table and see the value, and the bank's appraiser is going to justify the value that they see. Whose eyes do we not ask them to look through? 2 really important answers.
Their own.
Their own is one, and what's the other one?
Ours.
Yeah, right? So it doesn't say, hey, let's you and I, Shelley, take a look and see what we think. I want you to be clear about why we set that up that way. Because if you don't say anything, they're tempted to think that those are the 2 sets of eyes that we need to go through. So instead, we set it up very differently. We want you to take a look at this data through the eyes of both the buyer and the bank's appraiser. I one time had somebody say to me, so I guess my eyes don't count, huh? And I said, well, with respect, neither do mine. So the good news is it's not just you who's out, we're both out. But he got it, right? He understood why we were going down that path. And this is a perfect way for you to objectively say to a seller or a potential seller, hey, look, your opinion and my opinion about what the value is here really aren't relevant. Without having to say, hey, look, your opinion and my opinion aren't really relevant, right? We're going to refocus them based on the buyers and the bank's appraisers' eyeballs. And then what we're going to focus them on shows up right in the very next paragraph. Let's take a look at the best 3 comparable properties to yours that have sold in your city in the past 3 months. So for those of you who had some questions about the basic parameters for comps, Well, we just answered some of that. We'll answer the rest of it in the Know Your Numbers session that we're doing next Thursday, if you want real specifics about choosing comps. But you see that they have to be in the same city and they have to be in the past 3 months. Now, it also says the best 3 sold comparables. Let me ask you this question. Now, this is a tough one. Is 5 the same as 8? Not a trick question. No, the answer is no. Is 7, did I say 8? Is 5 the same as 3? Right? Is 7 the same as 3? No. Is 2 the same as 3? No. There's a reason why we ask you to pull the 3 best sold comps. Why do we ask you to pull the 3 best sold comps and use those with your seller conversation? Who else does that? I'll give you a hint. It starts with A. You got it, Herm. Thank you very much. Right? The appraiser is going to pull the best 3 sold comps. So we need to match what the appraiser is going to do and pull the best 3 sold comps. Here's another reason. When you pull more than 3, who does that confuse?
Everyone.
It confuses everybody. It confuses the seller and it confuses you. Right? There are times where people will come to me and say, can you help me with this? I have the best 8 sold comps and I just can't figure out, where to kind of like the best 8. That's not 3. Matter of fact, that's almost 3 times as many as 3. Or someone will say, well, here are the best 3 sold comps, but I included this 4th one too, because I kind of thought it looked good. Well, but wait a minute, is it one of the best 3? Well, no, but what if they ask about it? Well, then print it, have it in your briefcase, leave it on the side. And if they ask about it, you can say, hey, you know what? I pulled that one too. However, for these reasons, these 3 are better in terms of comparable sales than this one. I'm curious, would you agree with that? Yes? Okay, great. Put it back in my briefcase. No, you don't agree with it? Okay, well, talk to me about why this one might be a better sold comp, other than the fact that it's sold for more money. Right? We have to take the obvious off the table. The answer isn't it's a better comp because it's sold for more money. We have to look at the details here, right? So don't make it harder than it has to be. Find the best 3 sold comps and work with those. It is what the appraiser will do. And so you just need to mimic that. Yes, ma'am, Dana.
In what format do you present this to them? Should you have something printed out? And if so, what should it look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the answer is you get to make that decision, right? There are some people who, even though the whole toolkit thing is whatever it is, still use it for the presentational style. So they'll put the 3 sold comps in and then just pull those pages out and dump the rest, right? Or you can simply use printed MLS sheets. Or you could make a little PowerPoint and put them on a screen. Or you could choose to create your own kind of branded version of this and take the info off the MLS sheets and put it into a template that you create, if that's what you choose. My personal opinion, keep it simple. The MLS sheets, it's not like they look at you and say, oh my goodness, why isn't this fancy? It doesn't have to be fancy. The MLS data is the data that we're using. So to me, just printing the MLS sheets and laying them in front of people, now you don't have to worry about transferring the data. It's far less work. And I personally believe that people trust the data more because they see that you just printed it right out of the MLS. There's no funny business, no hocus pocus, no you inputting anything, no changing anything. It just is what it is from the MLS. So my personal vote is for simple MLS data. However, you do get to choose however you choose to do that. Does that answer that? Okay. We then go and ask the seller, I'm curious, have you seen any of these houses? Why might we ask them that question? Go ahead, Alex.
So you know where their knowledge may or may not lie.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we ask the question because what if they have? What if they've seen the house and you haven't? Right? Does that ever happen? Sure it does. Especially if you've chosen comps that are close into their neighborhood, right? Maybe you're lucky enough to have really geographically close comps, right? Maybe one of the comps was the son's best friend. And I one time asked that question to somebody and they said, well, I know that one. And I asked the follow-up and I said, oh, I'm curious, how do you know that property? He said, well, it's my brother-in-law's house. Like we went and had Thanksgiving there for 10 years in a row. Oh, okay, well, you certainly know that house better than I do. Right, and what's fascinating to me is that we don't ask those questions because we think we have to know the inventory better than the sellers. Guys, that is not a prerequisite for being hired. It's impossible for you to know every single house in every single town across the county or the state. That's not realistic. Right? Even doctors have to look up in medical books sometimes how to treat whatever you might have. People don't just have that knowledge necessarily off the top of their head for everything. So don't feel like it's weird for you to ask the question, get the answer, and if they know more about that house than you do, well, then you get to have a bit of a conversation around it. Wow, you know what, Donna? It sounds like you might be more the expert on that particular property than me tonight, right? You've been in it a bunch of times. I've been in it maybe once the last time it sold. And all we're looking to do by asking that question is to help understand where their knowledge base is, which is exactly what Alex said. Yes, Marion, did you have a question?
What if the seller says, somebody told me a very different price and it's a lot more attractive?
We're
Or
getting there.
somebody said that in this strong market, I have many options about selling.
Yeah, we're getting there. Give me another 10 minutes to get through this and I will spend as much time as you all need on objection handling. Just let me get there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so where are we? Have you seen any of these houses, right? And most of the time they say no, right? Great, and we move on. If they say yes, great. How do you know it? What are your thoughts about it? I would then always ask, and how do you believe that particular property compares to your home? I want to know what they're thinking about. If they're thinking that the property is not similar or at least basically comparable to their home, I want to know about that right now. Let's have that discussion, right? So I'm going to ask some questions. And then we move right into, would you take a moment and review each of these comparable homes? Again, I want you to look at them through the buyer's eyes. We're going to remind them that they're not looking at them through their own eyes, right? Because sellers typically view their own properties through very, very tainted lenses. The last home that I sold, I've sold property, but I've not sold a home in a long time. But I was a real estate licensee and I listed my own property and I listed it way too high. And the only way I got out of my own way was to go to Debbie, my business partner, and say, would you do me a favor? I'm firing myself. Could you take over and tell me what I need to do? Guys, it was 2003. So the market was moving relatively swiftly. It wasn't quite 2005, but it was moving relatively swiftly in 2003. I had 40 showings in 30 days and no offers. Like, duh, hello. This is not rocket science, right? The price was wrong. 40 showings in 30 days, no offers. And so we moved the price, not very much, but tucked it just under a price point. And within the next 6 days, I had 2 full price offers with a small adjustment, right? And I've seen that happen over and over and over and over and over again. For those of you who are brand new to this industry in the last 18 months, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Like, how could you have showings and not have 17 offers in the first 15 minutes? I don't understand, right? You're living through an anomaly in the market. That's not a normal pace of a market. And we'll talk about some metrics and a barometer for you to use to make sure that you're helping people make great decisions about, because sometimes mistakes are made, right? Sometimes mistakes are made in terms of a number, or sometimes something is put on the market and then the market shifts underneath that property and adjustments have to be made, right? So we're reminding them to look at the property through the buyer's eyes. And then we ask the question, I'm curious, if you had to purchase one of these 3 homes today, which one would it be? And they pick one, and we ask, why did you choose that one? And we let them tell the story of why they chose one of the comps that you put on the table. Can anyone figure out why we're asking them to do that? It's a really specific answer. It has to do with modeling. We are asking them to model the behavior that they themselves will then see from their own buyers. We're asking them to model for themselves and demonstrate how people choose property. Because the answers that you get when you ask them which of these 3 properties would you purchase and why, almost always come back from the perspective of, well, you know, of the 3, this one had the nicest kitchen and for about the same price. Or this one had more land for the same price. This one was the least expensive of the 3. This one was the most expensive of the 3. However, it had that extra half bath that I think I would personally like. Do you hear the language? We're asking them to model for themselves how buyers buy, right? Because buyers always buy based on value. You should probably write that down. Buyers always buy based on value. And I'm going to give you the definition of value so that you can use it as a tool. The definition of value is more for the same or the same for less. The definition of value is more for the same or the same for less, which is exactly what the seller does when they choose and then tell you why. They're demonstrating purchasing by value. So what's fun is if you then have some disagreements later on, because you put them through that exercise, you get to go back and revisit that to say, you know, I'm curious, earlier when you chose which of the 3 properties you would purchase, let's remember how you went about choosing that, right? And now they're thinking, oh man, you know what? I did choose the one that had the best value. So then I get to go back later on and say, all right, so the number that you've chosen here, based on the data that we've reviewed, do you believe that it represents the best value compared to the competition, knowing full well that you yourself demonstrated that that's how buyers buy? You see how it works? They've already given you an answer so that later on, if they look to challenge that, right, the only way they can challenge that is to say, yeah, but I'm different. Right? My house will be different. My house will attract people who aren't looking for value. Right? So that's the idea behind having them go ahead and choose that. They model that for themselves. And then we move to the question that some of you are terrified of. So let's hit it dead on, right? And would you agree that that the property they chose, right? That's the this in that sentence. Would you agree that this property that you've now chosen is basically, I want you to add that word in because it's an important word, is basically comparable to your home? What I found by testing out both of those sentences with and without the word basically, it's way harder for a seller to say that isn't basically comparable to my home if you've chosen decent comps, than it is for them to just generally say, yes, that's a comp. Basically comparable kind of broadens the field a little bit and makes it way harder for disagreement. And the reason that so many people are afraid to ask that question in this setting is because they're terrified that someone's going to say, no, none of these aren't comparable to my home. And guys, here's the fun part about it. I want to relieve your anxiety about that, because, can I repeat the question one more time? So it's right there in the middle of the script, John. Would you agree that this property is basically comparable to your home? It's like 5 paragraphs up from the bottom of that page. Here's the like, moment that I hope to give to all of you. It's okay if someone that you're sitting with doesn't agree with you or doesn't agree with the data. It's all right. You're not there defending the market, right? And sometimes we get it in our heads that we have to have like our Captain America shield and hammer, or well, I guess Captain America didn't have Thor's hammer until way later, but you get the point, right? And do some sort of defense. Clearly not a ton of Marvel fans on this call, because everyone was like, what is he talking about? Go and watch Avengers Endgame. That will explain the whole, why does Captain America have Thor's hammer reference? Or just Google it, maybe faster. Because Endgame is almost 3 hours long, so far less investment in time if you just Google it. The idea of not knowing or being challenged, if someone were to say, well, I don't think any of these are comparable to my home. That's okay, right? That's okay. And so instead of panic, you get to say, I appreciate that perspective. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you've come to that conclusion? Right? When people disagree with something I've put on the table, I want to know what your perspective is. I'm not going to instantaneously defend my perspective, because that's now defensive and contentious and runs dangerously close to me making the seller feel wrong. And remember, when I said to you, if you've crossed over into making them feel wrong or dumb, you don't win the business. Which is different than just being a yes person, right? Oh yes, whatever. That's not what I'm saying at all. However, you need to help guide them via consultation to better answers. So let's talk about it. Talk to me about the differences that you see. And my follow-up script, because then the seller can talk all about why they may not be comparable. And my follow-up script ends up being, you know what, I completely understand your perspective. I think you've made some really great points. Would it surprise you to know that out of all of the properties that have sold in the last 6 months in Wilton, or 3 months, I think the script says 3 months, right? In the last 3 months, these are the 3 best comparable homes. So there may be differences, which is kind of why I asked the question if they were basically comparable, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. And yet of all the properties, these are the 3 best ones. And ultimately we need to work with the data, just like the buyers and the buyer's appraiser will work with the best data that we can find. And these properties are those. Right? Great question, Marion. What does best mean? So the best 3 sold comps to me means they're within the last 3 months. 6 if you're in a push, but I like 3, especially in a fast moving market. 3 is better than 6. In the same town, not necessarily in the same geographic neighborhood, although if you can find properties that are geographically close, even better, but certainly the same town. The same style of home. So colonials comp colonials, ranches comp ranches, contemporaries comp contemporaries, condos comp condos, right? You're not going to mix and match style. And then basically the same beds, baths, square footage. That's pretty much the parameters. There are people who use land or garages. I'm not one of those people, because land and garages, especially when you live in Fairfield County or in most of Connecticut, right? We have very eclectic inventory in our state. We don't live in a state where they come in and they build 400 houses that are all the same except for the upgraded refrigerator or the the extra shelving in the mudroom, called the Thomas, the Jefferson, the George, and the Washington, right? We don't have a lot of those gated communities where everything is the same plus or minus $10,000. We have very eclectic inventory. We have old homes, we have new homes, we have different styles, right? Because we live in New England, we have 2 centuries worth of building that we have to figure out, right? Other parts of the country don't have that. So because we have such eclectic inventory, I think getting too specific too quickly is a mistake. And I'll show you when you come to the Know Your Numbers session next Thursday. I probably should verify it's next Thursday because I keep telling you it's next Thursday. I'm almost positive it's next Thursday at 11 o'clock. When you come to that, we'll dive deeper into why some of these other criteria may or may not be the best criteria to use. Some people use assessment, some people use age of home, right? I don't use much of that. I find the best that I can in the framework I just set out for you, and then I kind of open things up one by one and I look at them. Does it look the same? What do the pictures look like? Does the subject property have updates? Do these people have updates? If there's 4 properties, 3 of them have updated kitchens like the property that I'm comping, and 1 of them doesn't, well then that's a reason to pull that one out. Right? Or the opposite could be true. If the property I'm comping doesn't have an upgraded kitchen, and of the 4 that I boiled it down to, or the 5 that I boiled it down to, only 2 have upgraded kitchens, well, those definitely are in. And now I have to figure out which of the other 2 or 3 are the best, even though they don't have the upgraded kitchen, right? Acreage, meaning size and property. Oh, yeah. So I think I've answered these questions, right? Did I answer these questions? I think so. Okay. Whew. Okay. Moving on. And so here's the fun part. When all that discussion, if that discussion comes up, and again, for those of you who are less experienced on the listing side, the conversation comes up far less than what you fear, far less. And the more confidence that you have in the comps that you've chosen, and the more confidence you bring to the table, now you've reduced those conversations by another 20%. And at the end of the day, whether they agree or disagree with the comps, it kind of doesn't matter. Remember when we talked about the expired scripts? And I said to you, when you asked the question, I'm curious, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, are you still interested in getting your home sold? If they say yes, great, and you go on with your script. If they say no, great, I'm curious, where, right, you go on with the script. And if they say, you know, all of you realtors are horrible, terrible humans, you've all been calling me all morning, you get to say something like, you know, I am so terribly sorry. I'm curious if I just take a minute of your time, where we headed, had you sold your home, right? The answer is less relevant in certain scenarios. And this is another one of those scenarios. If they love the comps or hate the comps, you're going to have a discussion around them, either agree or agree to disagree, and then move on. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here is a list of all of the current competition in this range. Now, depending on the price point of the house that you're looking to list, will determine what range of competition you're in. Generally speaking, under $1 million, I like to be anywhere from $75,000 to $100,000 range, kind of 50 up, 50 down. You know, if I can tighten it to 75 and do 50 down and 25 up, something like that, right? So we can get some perspective on what the competition is. If you're in the higher price points, if you're over $1 million, you want to make sure that it's at least $100,000. If you're over $1.5 million or closing in on 2 million, it may even be more like a $150,000 or $200,000 range, right? So depending on price points, you're going to just pick a range. But the competition that you're choosing is just a one-line list. So, and it's not of comparable homes, it's of all the homes. Right? So if your best 3 sold comps are a colonial because your subject property is a colonial, when you pull the $75,000 range of the competition, you're including everything, the ranches, the colonials, the everything. Because that's the competition. And you lay that in front of them and say, as a reminder, the main data point from the market conditions information we discussed earlier was the word precise. Yes? And you wait for an answer. Because you want to make sure that you're reminding them that we did some work earlier. And the main takeaway from that work earlier was that you need to make a precise decision. That casual decisions or decisions that are not precise end up costing you money. Right? That was that earlier work with the month supply of inventory and the supply and demand graph. Right? We got them to recognize that precision matters in terms of getting your home sold. So we remind them of that. And so when you combine that, the idea of precision, with the comparable data you just reviewed, remember, you're always pointing them back to the data. Here's the multi-million-dollar question. Where do you feel you should position your property to outperform any and all of these other properties for sale? And then once you've asked that question, you do the most important thing that you can possibly do, which for many of you is the hardest thing to do, which is you take out your stapler and you staple your lips shut. Or for those of you who are more skilled, you sit on your lips. Either one works. But the point is, you have got to be quiet. You've got to allow silence to do the heavy lifting here. Now, trust me when I tell you, if you don't know about yourself that silence is hard for you, this is where you'll learn it really quick. Right? Because oftentimes we have this expectation that silence somehow means something's wrong, or silence somehow means that they're unhappy, or they're about to kick me out, or they're going to ask me a question I won't know the answer to. Guys, here's what I can tell you. Silence is just them working. It's them doing the job that you just asked them to do. They're thinking about the process. They're reviewing the data in their mind. They're looking at the list. Okay, so the question is, where should we position this property? Give them the time and the space that they need to come up with an answer. Some of you will be tempted to throw them a life preserver. Please keep all life preservers on the boat tied securely to the decking. Because again, if you step in and start to answer your own question, remember, two things are happening simultaneously now. You're always modeling behavior. I don't know about the rest of you, but when someone asks me a question and then tramples over me when I attempt to answer it with their own version of the answer, it drives me berserk. Like, why did you bother asking the question? If you have your own version of the answer, instead, don't ask a question. Just say, you know, it seems to me that, and boom. Don't ask a question. So you've just asked a question. If you jump in and answer it, you're modeling behavior that's how you're going to behave throughout the course of the transaction. And if you have a seller like me across the table, cross that person off, because that would make me nuts. Here's the second thing you're doing. You're robbing them of the opportunity to do the work that really gets them on the side of the market that ultimately brings them the best number. Remember, people have a misconception oftentimes about how to make money selling real estate. And the misconception they have is that the higher we price something, the more money I'll get. I can tell you I have 22 years of experience that says the exact opposite is true. Instead, what I would say is a rule is the more competitive you position a property based on current market conditions, the more money you make. And many of you, if not most of you, have proven that in the last 18 months with a very challenging market, with very challenging market conditions, right? For those of you who have been listing agents in the last 18 months versus those of you who have not, I think the ones who have would confirm what I'm about to say. People think that being a listing agent in the last 18 months has been like this pleasure cruise. Oh, no, no, no. It's just a whole different set of difficult scenarios, right? When you have something that sells so quickly with so many offers, that seems like, why wouldn't everyone want that all the time? Well, I can tell you, I've lived in that market, right? It wasn't quite like this one, the 04, 05 into early 06 market. It was close. It wasn't like this, but it was close. I've lived in that. I've lived in extreme buyers markets, and I've lived in the transitional markets in between. The transitional markets in between, that's my favorite. Where not one party or the other feels like they have all the power, right? Being a listing agent today, you have a lot of really challenging conversations to have with sellers who feel like they can do anything to anyone at any time and get away with it. And that's simply not true, right? You can't treat people like crap and expect them to hang around, right? And so sometimes that creates some issues. What was the point of me saying that? Right. And so you're into, was there a question? I thought I heard somebody unmute. No? Okay. So we allow silence to do that heavy lifting and allow them to choose a spot. You can encourage them. Like if the silence goes too long and you want to rip your face off because you just can't stand the fact that there's so much silence, you can say things like, I do know how challenging a decision this can be. Please take your time. Or you can say things like, I know how tough this can be for sellers. I'm curious, do you have any questions? May I help in any way? Right? You can offer some assistance, but you're not, the life preserver that you're not throwing is, let me circle, let me give you a hint, right? Let me move my pen just so that it's pointing to just the spot that, all these little ins and outs. I know how tough this is. Trust me, there are 469,000 reasons why I know how tough this is, right? You're not giving any clues. And so then they come up with a decision. And the decision will either be an appropriate choice or a less appropriate choice. Notice I didn't say right or wrong, because there's not a right or wrong answer to this. There's an appropriate choice to accomplish their goals, and then there are less appropriate choices which may not accomplish their goals as quickly, as effectively, or ever. Right? And so that's how I encourage you to look at this. Not right or wrong, appropriate based on the goals that they have set for themselves. If you remember yesterday, Donna said that she wanted a buyer quickly. Right? And let's just take us out of the current market where things sell very quickly. Right? Let's put us in more of a normalized market. Do you agree that there are numbers that Donna could have chosen based on her goal of finding a buyer quickly and hitting a certain number? Do you agree that there are numbers that she could have chosen that would get her there faster versus taking way more time, if ever, get her there? Sure, right? Because of the concept of negotiation versus competition. Right? Do you guys know the difference between negotiation and competition? So I'll tell you, it's an objection handling script. I will run through it with you. So let's get there in half a second. Let's say the seller picks a spot that matches up kind of with the comps. It matches up with the competition. It's kind of what was in your head anyway. That happens about 50 to 60% of the time. Just keeping it real, about 50 to 60% of the time. I'm not going to tell you it happens 90 to 95% of the time, because that would be lying to you. I haven't done that once. I'm not going to start tonight. So 50 to 60% of the time when you go through this process, sellers will make the right choice. They'll make the appropriate choice for their needs, to achieve their goals. And so you get to say, excellent, I think you're making a great choice. Remember, they need to be validated for the work that they just did. It's hard for them to choose that number. So validate it and make sure that there's a little victory around that. I think you're making an awesome choice. And so with that, if you're comfortable with that number, we're going to write that right here on the contract. And the only thing left to do is for you to sign at the bottom and allow me to get started. And you're off to the races. Now, sometimes that 40 to 50% of the time, they may choose a number that isn't quite as appropriate for their goals. Now, it might surprise you that about 10% of the time, they choose a number that's way lower than what you were thinking. So sometimes the objection handler is not about why the property won't sell all the way up here, because they've chosen, again, only about 1 out of 10 times, so 10% of the time, they'll choose a number based on the comps and the competition that may be lower. And so then you get to ask an interesting question. So that's an awesome choice. I'm curious, what led you to that number? And they'll tell you, well, the comps were here and there seems to be a lot of competition. Excellent. And so may I express just one small concern about that number? Well, sure. So my one small concern about that number is that you may, depending on the market conditions, you may end up leaving a little bit of money on the table with that one. I'm curious, do you have a comfort level pushing the number a smidge, knowing that the market data seems to support something slightly higher? And then they say yes or no. Now, let's get to what most of you are wanting to have a conversation around. And that is, well, what if they choose a number that's just like out in outer space? Before I answer that, let me remind you that this process is not devoid of you bringing a number to the table, right? Because you brought the best 3 sold comps, right? The best 3 sold comps were 465, 471, and 479. So just by choosing those 3 comps, aren't you kind of highlighting at least a range? You've certainly narrowed things down for the seller by choosing those 3 comps. Do you agree? And then you bring them the list of competition bracketed in that sort of 70, in a 475-ish range. I would bracket it $75,000. I would do like 425 to 500, something like that. So you're not bringing them a number. You're just not stating what the best positioning for them is, because that really needs to be determined by them based on their goals. You've done all the kind of hints and pointing with the data that you've provided. And let me go on record saying this. You're bringing unmanipulated data, right? This isn't about finding the best 3 sold comps that has them undervalue their home by $30,000 so the sale happens quickly, right? Because that's not fiduciary representation. I know I don't have to say that necessarily out loud, and yet I will, just to go on record saying it, right? So this is you. Remember, the job is to help them maximize their equity. So you are finding the best 3 sold comps that do just that maximize the equity. You're not looking for low comps to affect a quick sale. So you end up with that in that scenario where you're asking them to choose a number kind of between 425 and 500, because that's the bracket you've set, and you've given them 3 comps in that sort of 4 3/4-ish range. So question number 1. In today's market, if the seller said, well, it seems to me like we could go right up to $499 or $500,000 on this one, what would your thought be? With the comps in that 475-ish range, to put it on the market at $499 or $500? I see some of you nodding your heads. I couldn't agree more. The answer is, I think you're making a great choice, right? Because you have more, you have the luxury of having a little more room. That's not a bad place to put that property at all today. Now, in a different environment, $499 or $500, maybe, Gesundheit, Marion, maybe outside of the realm of what really gets the job done. They may have to be tighter, right? The numbers really may be closer to 479 or 485 in that scenario, right? In a differently paced market. In a fast-paced market, you have a little bit more room. Here's the other thing. If you really think that based on the comps that 489 is the right number, and the seller wants to put it on for 499 or 500, I'm not sure why you're arguing. You're practicing sales prevention in that scenario, right? Don't do that. It's pretty much the same number. Let's be more agreeable without being detrimental. I'm not saying do things that are detrimental to the seller. What I'm saying is recognize that accuracy in positioning is science and art. It's not one or the other. It is both, which is why we go with the best 3 sold comparables and a list of current competition, because they need to know kind of what the appraiser is going to think based on comps, but then they also need to see what's out there. Who am I competing against? How am I going to do that? Maybe they choose 499 and you get to look at the numbers and say, you know, I think that's a great choice. May I ask a question? What do you notice about the number of properties that are currently on the market for 499? And again, this may not be relevant in a fast moving market like we have today. And yet I want to make sure that you're not being taught only from the perspective of today, because today doesn't last forever. And the seller gets to look at it and say, well, it looks like there's a lot. Yeah, I would agree. And so from a price pointing perspective, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, is there another number that might make almost as much sense as that 499 that kind of moves you out of the crowded field of 499? I don't know, maybe I'm looking for 495. Is that different than 499? Well, it might be different enough to have them stand out, right? But again, you get to consult through that based on what the actual data looks like. Maybe there's only one other property at 499, so bam, let's go. Now, so what happens if a person says, well, so this competition is only between 425 and 500, and I was really looking for more like a 550 list. I understand. I'm curious, what specific evidence exists based on the data that we've reviewed that would support that number? That's just an objection handling script. I think it's in your, it's towards the bottom of your page, right? So it's already written in there for you. That's a winner, by the way. What specific evidence exists to support that number? That's not me saying you're right. It's not me saying you're wrong. I'm just looking for you to back it up with the data, right? And so we're asking the seller, again, to participate, to kind of jump on in. How does that look? Please keep in mind, we have to justify these numbers to both the buyer and the buyer's appraiser. So based on the specific, based on the data that we've reviewed, what specific evidence can you point to that would allow us to back that up?
Rick, would
Yes.
would it be advantageous to have sitting in your briefcase printouts of the homes that actually are on the market between 5 and 550, so you can show them and they'll be able to come to the conclusion that those are better or bigger, somewhat, better property, and that's why they're going for that higher price?
Yeah, so what I would say is, if you're in the office, right, you have big screen TVs in each of the conference rooms. So let's have the MLS available, because I think the simpler path to that, Dana, instead of printing all those things and having them in your briefcase, is let's just go to the MLS, right?
Yeah.
Well, I was hoping
that's
for
what I'm thinking,
550.
functionally the same thing.
Right. And if you happen to be at someone's house, I would have my laptop and I would keep that to let's go to the MLS. Let's take a look at that. If you're interested in, and then we get to have a conversation. Here are the properties that have sold recently in that 525 to 550 range, right? And almost always when you're jumping up another $50,000, there's a square footage change. There's sometimes a bedroom change. There's sometimes a bath change, right? You start to see some of the patterns. There may be a location change in certain towns, right? Certain towns and cities have some price variations based on location in that particular town or city. And so comparables may have to be viewed that way. But diving into the MLS to help justify that is not a bad, I encourage that, absolutely. Marion asked a question before that I want to make sure we get back to, and the question was, what if the objection is, well, someone else told me they could get more money, right? Or my house was worth more. And so the objection handler that I would suggest for that is, wow, that is fascinating. I'm curious, did they go through this same process with you regarding market conditions at a macro level, so that we could really understand what's happening at the town level, and then micro level with comparable homes? Now, when you ask that question, the seller is almost always going to look to be dismissive and say, well, yes, of course. Great. Do you have that data available that we can review together? Let's haul it out. If someone else said, if someone else found a better route for your property to be worth more money, I'm happy to be wrong. Let's just haul it out and take a look at it. If someone drove by at 40 miles an hour and gave you a call and said, I think I can get $50,000 more, well, then I'm less impressed, right? I want to see the data that supports that. And the reason I'm driving this, guys, back to the data is that, remember, it's not about someone's opinion. And oftentimes when people say things like Marion put on the table of someone told me they could get me more, or someone told me that my house was worth more, those are easy words to say. I can walk into any seller scenario and say, I can get you X, sign here, just to collect listings. It's not fiduciary representation. I haven't done a whole lot of homework. And in some cases, it's just simply false. And so my objection handler for that is, that sounds great. Do you have the data that they supplied to justify it? Let's review it together. If they found something I didn't, great. Let's use it and make that adjustment. My experience tells me that most of the time, there isn't that data. They don't have it, because the data that somebody else brought to the table was the same as mine, because it's all the same market. There's only one bowl we're all fishing from, right? With the data. Instead, they brought the data, ignored a lot of it, and decided to up the ante. It's called buying a listing, by the way. And so the question, I think that, let's see, marketing promises with less disruption to their lives can be compelling. Yeah, absolutely. However, that has nothing to do with pricing and positioning, right? So those are two separate conversations. And I think the discussion about process and marketing, again, in my world, happens up front with the pre-listing package. What you're there to do at the actual listing appointment is to work through the market conditions. Answer any questions, certainly. Questions, comments, concerns? What else do you have? What else have you experienced that we should address? What else are you fearful of, even if you haven't experienced it, that we should address in terms of walking people through a pricing and positioning conversation?
Rick?
Yes.
What if you get someone that you've laid everything out, and despite what you've said, because it all makes sense, at least to you, and for whatever reason, they think they can get $50,000 more, and they want you to put it on it. Since we're using the number of 500, they want you to put it at 550 or 569.9, or what do you do with that?
Yeah,
and
so
dogmatic about it.
Great question. And so the first thing I'll say is, you each need to have a policy in your own business about where your tolerances are. And what I mean by tolerances, you need to have For me, it was always about 10%. I was willing to have a conversation and perhaps take a listing that was about 10% higher than where I really thought that the market said it should be, with a qualifying conversation, right? And so the first thing I'll do, Cal, in that scenario is I'll look to objection handle it, right? And so I'll ask the question. So Cal, that sounds like an interesting number. Oh, and by the way, just before I get into a role play, for me, if I don't think the number makes sense based on the data, I won't repeat it. So if Cal says to me, I really want to put it on at 550, I'll say to him, that's an interesting number, or, you know, let's talk about that number. I won't say the word 550. I'll only say numbers that I am in agreement with based on the data. And here's why. The second Cal hears me say the word 550, even if all the words around it are, I really think that 550 would be a horrible, terrible tragedy, right? Which is not a script, by the way. I'm just making a point. Even if the words around it are negative, what Cal hears me say is, oh, 550. I said 550. He said 550. There's no reason to have this conversation anymore. So I won't say the word. If Cal says 550, I'll say, so, you know, what specific evidence based on the data that we've reviewed justifies that number? That's always my go-to. Sometimes that's my go-to multiple times, because the first time Cal might say, well, I didn't think that one of those comps was great, and I think one of the comps we need to adjust upwards. Great. Would you mind if we went back and had that conversation? Talk to me about which of the comps you think might need to be adjusted, and can you talk through the justification on that? Right. My approach is to have sellers work for the thing they're asking for. I want them to recognize that the game of real estate has nothing to do with you just deciding a number because that's what you want, or that's what you heard, or that's what you think, or that's what you need, right? Or that's what your horoscope said, whatever the reason, you get to say that, and the real estate community and the industry itself gets to just jump on that. I'm going to work through, let's justify it. And so we might go kind of round and round on that. Well, you know, if I don't get at least 525, I can't afford to buy my condo down in Boca. Understood. I'm curious, would it surprise you to know that the idea of what it is you need out of a property oftentimes plays very little role in how buyers make decisions about which properties they'll purchase? Case in point, if you remember earlier, when I asked you to choose one of the 3 properties that I put on the table, right? You chose based on value. I'm curious, at the number that you mentioned, do you believe that buyers will see value? And so maybe Cal says, well, of course, I have a great house. You absolutely do have a great house. I could not agree more. I'm curious, have you ever discussed the definition of value? Cal says, no. Well, may I? So the definition of value is more for the same or the same for less. I'm curious, based on the data that we reviewed, can you place your home either in a more for the same or the same for less scenario at that number? Right? We're going to keep working through it. We're going to keep asking the questions. Now, everything I've asked, I haven't been challenging. I haven't been defensive. I'm more than happy to not see something. And so we go round and round, right? I'm going to answer your question, Cal. I'm just getting there the long way.
Okay.
We go round and round, and Cal's kind of digging his heels in, saying, you know what, dude, I appreciate it, but it's kind of 550 or nothing for me. And now I have a decision to make. So the first thing I will say to Cal is, Cal, I so appreciate you. I appreciate your knowledge of the market. I hope that the market has been pretty clear based on the data that we've reviewed. It sounds as though you and I may just have to agree to disagree on what the direction the data is pointing us in. That said, and now here's my policy, right? So at 550, I would have said yes at 500. That's within that 10% tolerance, right? If the market's moving quickly, or we have a different conversation where I say to Cal, so you and I may have to agree to disagree on what the market is, the direction the market is pointing us in. Can we agree on a strategy forward, knowing that 550 number, right? Because so now I've waved the white flag, because now I'm saying the 550. I've waved the white flag because I was simply unable to walk Cal down with some objection handlers. So at 550, can we agree that after 14 days, the market will have pretty much spoken about whether or not it's going to accept or reject that number for your property? And if so, can we agree on where we'll move or adjust the number tonight so that on day 15, that's an automatic adjustment? Right, we're just going to talk about a strategy now. And maybe Cal says yes, maybe Cal says no. And we just keep having a conversation. It's not an argument. We're just continuing to move that forward. And perhaps Cal then feels like, well, you know what? Yeah, we can kind of try it for 2 weeks. And then if not, we'll move it down. We'll come to an agreement on what that number moved down is. Now, I do have a responsibility to Cal to say, let's kind of just talk this through, because experience and statistics show that properties that come on the market a little higher than the market indicates and then have to take a reduction in order to attract a buyer generally earn less for the seller than ones that come on the market kind of in that sweet spot and accept offers without a reduction. And I'll show you guys when we do the broker metrics class, there's a report you can pull in broker metrics that shows that, right? So I'm curious, Cal, are you willing to roll the dice on that and potentially earn less from the property in your pursuit of more? Now Cal has some more thinking to do, and yet he still gets to make the decision, yes or no, right? Perhaps Cal and I have a conversation. Cal, I'm curious, what's driving you up to the number that you mentioned? Well, because people, I know what happens. They see that number and they're always going to offer less. Well, that sometimes does happen. I'm curious, Cal, has anyone ever discussed with you the difference between negotiation and competition? And Cal says no. And I said, well, may I explain? Sure. Negotiation happens when a buyer approaches a property and says, I kind of like this property. I'm not too keen on the number that's attached to it. So let me make an offer that's lower and see what we can do. Competition shows up when a buyer approaches your property and says, oh man, I really like this property. And at that number, I'm certain there will be other people just like me who like that property at the same time. I'm worried that if I don't act quickly, someone else may act and be the winner. And so, Cal, I'm curious, which do you think is more beneficial to your bottom line? Driving negotiation or driving competition? Right, you see how that objection handler works, right? So now we're talking about, and I don't know if you noticed what I did with my hands. right? Because sometimes the body language helps. Driving negotiation and I pointed down, or driving competition and I pointed up. And I left my hands there because I want him to see that what he's really looking for happens at a lower number. If people are fighting over your house versus somebody kind of seeing it and kind of saying, yes, but I'm not really thrilled to, like if they're fighting over your house, that's better for your bottom line, right? But you asked that as a question. Does that help, Cal?
Yes, it does. I guess the follow-up question I would have is, okay, I agree with you. In 2 weeks, we can do whatever we want. And what happens if we come back and we say, okay, 5 1/4? How does it, in perception, I'm now reading all of the ads. Geez, that house was at 550. Now it's at 5 1/4. They're trying to figure out what the price is. And am I automatically getting into a negotiation establishing for myself?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm curious. So are you asking that question as a seller? Are we still role playing?
Yeah, let's.
Yeah, right. And so my answer to that would
Sorry.
be, you know what, Cal, that's a great question. What do you think the answer to that is?
What do I think the answer is?
Yeah,
I think you should go to the number that we established, because that's what the competition is around.
yeah, agreed. And so my point is, if your seller were to say, so are we in danger then of kind of falling out of favor because we're taking reductions? Oftentimes we're very quick to give answers. I would ask another question, because the reason Cal asked that question as a seller is because he knows the answer and he's concerned about it. And again, consulting people to self-discovery is always far more powerful than just answering a question. So my question back to Cal would be, that's an excellent question. What do you think the answer to that is? And Cal says, well, I'm kind of afraid that all of a sudden it's going to look like, we don't know what we're doing, and someone's going to come in and offer even less. Yeah, I think that's a very astute answer. I think you're 100% right. I'm curious, what action do you think you could take up front that might alleviate that from occurring? How could we solve that issue before it even shows up? Right.
I'll give you my answer.
Yes, sir.
Let's go with the price that you said we should go at.
Yeah.
You just walked me out of it.
Yeah. Right. And so, and guys, trust me when I tell you, if you will continue to consult, sometimes sellers all of a sudden have that kind of eye-opening moment and say, oh, you know what? This kind of sounds like I'm barking up the wrong tree here. Right. And again, it's not about me being right and Cal being wrong. It's about suddenly Cal saying, you know what? I don't think I want to risk that. When you ask questions with the words concern or risk in them, that's another really strong, powerful way to ask a question, to say, you know what, may I express a concern about that? I'm curious, what is your tolerance for risk, knowing that this may, the competition might happen here and negotiation might happen there? Are you willing to roll the dice and kind of hope, knowing that hope really isn't a strategy, that sellers might fight over your house at a higher number? Right? Lots of different conversations that can be had that continue to point people in a direction. Guys, it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work. However, if you're willing to put yourself out there and have more of those conversations and keep the dialogue going, oftentimes you can make some adjustments. Or if it's within your tolerance and the seller is willing to look at the next step down, and by the way, sign a document that night. When they sign the listing contract, they also sign a reduction document for 2 weeks later. Because trust me, I've been there. We have a conversation, Cal says yes, and then 13 days later, I call Cal and say, hey, I'm sending you over that document. And he says, well, I'm not sure. So you get that signed right then and there so that we can then take that next jump down. Okay, I know there's some stuff in the chat, and I think Marion, you had unmuted as well. So it's 5:56. I'm sorry that we're running out of time, but Marion, you were first. So go ahead and unmute and ask that question.
No, I think it's been answered
Okay.
in the conversations.
Got it. John says you mentioned macro and micro a lot through the class. What I find difficult as a new agent is where do you get your info from, because there are so many sources. It's hard because sometimes it can lead to information overload. In the pivot shift Zoom calls, they talk about being the local economist of choice, but then it's like, where do I begin? Okay, so great question. And here's the answer. Don't make it hard. Your source of information for most things is the MLS, because that's the relevant bucket of data for real estate conversations. The macro piece, I made it easy for you. All you have to do with macro are the two things that I showed you, the brokermetric supply and demand graph and the month supply of inventory. Yes, you could talk about 97 other things. And frankly, in earlier iterations of this whole thing, we did have more on the table, and we've slowly taken it off the table because guess what? Sellers are not interested in all that data. It confuses us, it confuses them, just like more than 3 sold comps. So make it simple. Source the data for the comps and the market stuff out of the MLS, and the other 2 macro pieces are just the 2 that I showed you. And then you don't have to worry about where you're getting it, if that's helpful. Yes, Mr. and Mrs., what are your thoughts about the market in the next 3 months? So that's the sellers asking you at a listing table, what's going to happen the next 3 months? Yep. So that's a great question, Marion, and I get asked that a lot. I can answer it a couple of different ways. The first is I haven't a clue, simply because none of us have that crystal ball, right? However, save some really massive event happening, like a 9/11 event or the start of a pandemic, to use topical information. Save that. The next 3 months, save seasonality, November, December, January. And seasonality simply means a reduction in inventory, generally speaking. I'm not sure we're going to see much of a change at all. Interest rates are not necessarily slated to rise, and I think we'll see things stay pretty much even keel. I'm curious, why do you ask? Right? That's the question. Why do you ask about the next 3 months? And if Marion says, well, because we're thinking of waiting until January or February to put the house on the market. Understood. So I'm curious, do you believe that it is better for your bottom line to have more or less competition in terms of additional listings in the market? And of course, Marion says, well, it's better for my bottom line if there's less competition. Agreed. Is it okay with you if we just jump back to the broker metrics supply and demand chart that we referenced earlier? I just want to point out to you that seasonality shows that in the next 3 months, inventory will continue to decline. And so I'm curious, does it make sense to you to put your house on the market today, knowing that your competition will continue to erode, which makes you stand out from the pack even more, or wait until February when, as you can see on that graph, inventory starts to climb again, so now your competition starts to go up? Which do you think is best for your bottom line? Right? Guys, I don't know if you've recognized, but my answers almost always point back to data. It's where I shine. It's where I'm the specialist. It's where and I don't say I meaning me, I mean you. That's where you need to bring it in terms of having the data, having the information, and helping people walk through it. Because if you remember, 4 weeks ago, I told you your job description is to interpret current conditions such that the client can make the best decision possible. Well, all we're doing is interpreting data to help them make a good decision. It might seem like waiting till February is the right thing to do, except that's not what the data shows. The data shows it's better for your bottom line if you go on right now at the right number, right? But I'm not going to say that because Marion trusts it more if I ask her those questions and she kind of puts it through her own brain and her data bank to say, that's an interesting point, right? I'll have less competition, which means I may be more appealing to more people because the buyers are out there. Okay. Right? And she comes to that herself. I hope that answered that.
Thank you.
Alex, I think you might be bringing us home because it's already 6:02.
Yeah, you know what? Well, I'll pass. I'll let us go home.
Okay, that's
Thank you.
perfect. And Diane, virtual staging, let's dive into that tomorrow when we finish the pricing conversation and move into marketing and then the anatomy of a seller transaction. Is it a simple question? Is it a yes or no question? Or is it why don't you ask it? Go ahead.
Well, I lost the listing because the home was not in good condition when I saw it. And she was really just doing some yard sales and so forth. And the particular agent that got the listing did a whole virtual staging presentation on the MLS. And I was just wondering, when do you start to, change from reality to a virtual stage?
So I think the answer to that is it depends on the house, right? If the house doesn't show well, you may want to virtually stage it. Just recognize that when you virtually stage something, you got to have a bazillion disclaimers all over everything, so that the general public understands that this is not how the house really looks, right? There have been issues and lawsuits with virtual staging. So, the idea of virtual staging solves everything is not always the path. It may win. It's a cool tool to win listings. I don't discourage it, and yet I think you have to be cautious when you use it and how you use it. And I think the real answer to your question is there are certain homes where virtually staging absolutely is a path forward, and there are certain homes where it's just less relevant.
Yeah, I just wanted to share from my experience, something that might be a good thing.
Excellent. Awesome. All right, guys, thank you for the extra few minutes. I appreciate it. And thank you, Alex, for reminding me that today is Thursday. And so we don't meet until next Tuesday. We do meet.
Okay, good. That was my question.
Next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So we'll meet all week. We will finish sellers halfway through Tuesday, dive into buyers, and finish up.
Does
Guys,
Tuesday?
I have one more question. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Does Tuesday include the 3 o'clock command?
It does.
Okay.
It does. Unless you hear from me differently, it does. Debbie's away in Ohio, but I think she's coming home on Sunday. So I think she'll be back and ready to rock on 3 o'clock on Tuesday. So unless you hear from me differently, 3 o'clock start on Tuesday, 4 o'clock for me. Julie, go ahead.
Sorry, and I don't have all the details, but listening to some people, I think it was the Early Birds Real Estate, they were talking about like 6 things that, I have versus other people don't have. And they flew through, these are the 6 things, value propositions that they have and could offer. Is that something that Keller Williams sort of pushes or teaches, or have you ever heard of any of that?
So that's a hard
I'll
question
listen to it
answer. Again. Yeah, go
and
back.
quickly.
If you can give me the list, I can point you in the direction of here's where you find each of those things.
Yep.
But without
like
the
reverse
list,
prospecting and some other stuff. Yep.
Yeah, without the list, it's hard to answer. Just bring that back or shoot it to me when you find it over the weekend, and I'll bring an answer to you and then back
Tuesday.
to everybody on Tuesday.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Have a good night. See you soon.
Have a nice weekend, or maybe tomorrow.
Yes.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.